Hello everyone, how you doing? My name is Tomorrow. I'm coming to you live from my very own Spreaker podcast radio. It is an app that you can download. It's called Spreakers, Spreaker, Spreaker podcast, excuse me, Spreaker podcast radio app. You can download the app. It's available on Google Play and also the App Store. You can also, once you download it, you're going to mark my podcast as your favorite. This way you can receive push notifications as soon as I publish something new. Or what you can do is go to the Spreaker's website, and then you can go to my profile page. Then from there, you can find all my shows and episodes. My profile name is Tomorrow. So everybody, for the month of February, I'm dedicating to African American heritage. And every episode will be based on an event or person who helped enrich our culture. I'm also going to acknowledge a Black-owned business every episode that is right here in Hampton Roads, and tell you all about that so you all can show your support. So my beginning topic is, who was Jim Crow? I found an article that was written by Becky Little. It starts out as, and I'm going to go ahead and read that article to you all. It starts out as, who was Jim Crow? 50 years ago, the Voting Rights Act targeted the laws and practices of Jim Crow. Here's where the name came from. In 1944, the Detroit chapter of the NAACP held a mock funeral for him. In 1963, participants in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom symbolically buried him. Racial discrimination existed throughout the United States in the 20th century, but it had a special name in the South: Jim Crow. 50 years ago, this Thursday, President Lyndon B. Johnson tried to bury Jim Crow by signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. The Voting Rights Act and its predecessor, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, fought racial discrimination in the South by banning segregation and public accommodations and outlawing the poll taxes and tests that were used to stop African Americans from voting. Today, we still use Jim Crow to describe that system of segregation and discrimination in the South. But the system's namesake isn't actually Southern. Jim Crow came from the North. Jump, Jim Crow. Thomas Dartmouth Rice, a white man, was born in New York City in 1808. He devoted himself to the theater in his 20s, and in the early 1830s, he began performing the act that would make him famous. He painted his face black and did a song and dance he claimed were inspired by a slave he saw. The act was called Jump, Jim Crow, or Jumping Jim Crow. He would put on not only blackface makeup, but shabby dress that imitated in his mind and white people's minds of the time the dress and aspect and demeanor of the Southern enslaved black person, says Eric Lott, author of Love and Theft, Blackface, Minstrelsy, in the American Working Class, and professor of English and American Studies at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Rice's routine was a hit in New York City, one of the many of places in the North where working class whites could see blackface minstrelsy, which was quickly becoming a dominant form of theater and a leading source for popular music in America. Rice took his act on tour, even going as far as England, and his popularity grew. His stage name seeped into the culture. Jumping Jim Crow, and just Jim Crow, generally sort of became shorthand, or one shorthand anyway, for describing African Americans in this country, says Lott. So much so, he says, that by the time of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was 20 years later in 1852, one character refers to another as Jim Crow. In a strange full circle, Rice later played Uncle Tom in blackface stage adaptations of the novel, which often reversed the book's abolitionist message. Regardless of whether the term Jim Crow existed before Rice took it to the stage, his act helped popularize it as a derogatory term for African Americans. To call someone Jim Crow wasn't just to point out his or her skin color. It was to reduce that person to the kind of caricature that Rice performed on stage. An 1860 profile of T.D. Rice published after his death mentions the conflicting accounts of who may have inspired his Jim Crow act and where he first performed it. From the theater to the legislature. After the Civil War, Southern states passed laws that discriminated against newly freed African Americans. And as early as the 1890s, these laws had gained a nickname. In 1899, North Carolina's Goldsboro Daily Argus published an article subtitled "How Captain Tilley of the A and N and North NC enforces the Jim Crow law." Travelers on the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad during the present month have noted the drawing of the color line in the passenger coaches, reported the paper. Captain Tilley is unceasing in his efforts to see that the color line, otherwise the Jim Crow law, is literally and fearfully enforced. Experts don't really know how a racist performance in the North came to represent racist laws and policies in the South, but they can speculate. Since the phrase originated in blackface minstrelsy, Lott says that it's almost purposely accurate that it should come to be the same name for official segregation and state-sponsored racism. I think probably in the popular white mind, he says, it was just used because that's just how they referred to black people. Sometimes in history, a movie comes out or a book comes out And it just changes the language. And you can point at it, says David Pilgrim, director of the Jim Crow Museum and vice president for diversity and inclusion at Ferris State University. And in just this case, he says, I think it just evolved. And I think it was from many sources. However it happened, the meaning stuck. Blackface minstrelsy's popularity faded, but never died. And T.D. Rice is barely remembered. Most people today don't know his name, but everybody knows Jim Crow. Thank you for listening to that article. I encourage you to look beyond this article, to do more research on the complexities of the Jim Crow era and how the Black community was affected then and today. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for my next episode.